Hi, I'm Marsh from StrataGames, and today we're talking about how to mulligan in Black Sack. There's a lot of intricacies to how to mulligan. I think in general, mulliganing is one of the hardest things you can do in the game of Magic, and I figured it'd be good to talk about. Now, I'm going to be using my stock list as an example. If you're interested in the deck list, check that in the description, and if you want a 60-page guide with 37 sideboard matchups on this deck, you can check that out in the description as well. So let's start by looking at the ideal hand, what you want to see as your opener, and this deck has two hands that I would consider god hands. They're the hands that can present the fastest win in a vacuum. The first hand is a turn 3 win. With this hand, we can play Swamp Shambler on turn 1. Turn 2, we play Swamp Vampire. And turn 3, we play our Swamp, Stamina the Shambler. We can sacrifice it and all of the scrolls it makes, which makes 6 sacrifice triggers for the Bloodthorn Vampire, making it a 13-13. We attack with that, hit our opponent for 13, and then Rite of Consumption to deal another 13, 26 damage on turn 3. Now that's obviously in a vacuum. If your opponent has any interaction at all or any blockers that can throw this out of whack, but this hand is just very, very strong in general. I would probably keep it in the dark no matter what. If I knew my opponent was a removal heavy deck, I might be a little more hesitant because this relies fully on the Vampire. And if they're a counterspell deck, being able to counterspell the Rite of Consumption would leave us with nothing on the board. So definitely things to keep in mind. I would say this is the ideal opening hand against decks like Grixis Affinity and Jund Wildfire that don't have the most removal in their main deck. Usually they play like 3 to 4 removal pieces, but they have a lot of card draw to find them, except they also play Karat Clan Shaman, which with Death Touch is almost always going to be the end of our game. We're going to lose just right when they do that. Sometimes even without Death Touch, they're going to be able to sacrifice enough artifacts to wipe our entire board. But they play a lot of tap lands, and they play a lot of 2-drops that don't actually affect the board in any way. Ichor Wellspring, Cleansing Wildfire, Fanatical Offering, and that gives us the time, especially if we're on the play, to win on turn 3 before they've even been able to develop anything actually relevant on the board. This hand also represents one of our 2 primary win conditions with the deck, which is a Rite of Consumption, ideally on a Vampire, but even a Carrion Feeder or a Beetle. And speaking of those, the second god hand is reliant on Carrion Feeder and Beetle. Bloodthorn Vampire can pump up a huge amount of damage on one single turn, but the opposite of that is Carrion Feeder plus Beetle, which can grow and continue to deal damage every single turn. With this hand here, you can play a Swamp and a Beetle on turn 1, a Swamp, a Beetle, and then a Feeder on turn 2, attack for 1 with your Beetle, assuming there's no blockers. And on turn 3, you can play both of your Link Breakers and your Sage, sacrifice all 4 of those creatures and their tokens to make it so that you have 3 5/5 Beetles and Feeders being able to attack in for 15 damage on turn 3. And then every turn after that, you can also attack for 15 damage. This is a very fast clock that's going to be able to win most games. It is reliant on your Feeder surviving, which is why I want to play it on turn 2 and not turn 1. But also, depending on your opponent, you might want to wait until you actually have the fodder down to be able to play the Feeder, because if they have lightning bolts and things like that, you won't have any protection by playing it on turn 2. But just in a vacuum, this hand can present 15 damage on turn 3 and every turn after that. I would say this is the ideal hand for creature-based decks that have very little removal. Things like Elves and Walls or Spy Walls, because you're able to put up multiple attackers that after that third turn where you attack for 15, they're suddenly going to have to block all 3 of them every single turn to be able to survive, assuming they don't gain any life. And if they start losing 3 creatures every single turn, there's no way they're going to be able to keep up with that. Eventually, they'll just run out of creatures. Both of these hands are exceptional because they present a very clear game plan that's not reliant on what you draw and that can win the game between turn 3 and 5. These are obviously the best versions of these hands, but any hand like this that has a clear game plan that's able to present a win by turn 5 if you're not disrupted is what you want to look for. Obviously, your opponent could have removal, they could have counterspells or whatever, but if you're in the dark and you end up playing against High Tide, Tron, Cycle Storm, any of those combo decks that are likely to win after turn 4 or 5, you want to have a fast game plan to be able to win before they do. But any hand that has, I would say, 2 or 3 of these elements is going to be generally pretty good. If you have 1 Carrion Feeder and 1 Beetle and some fodder, that's already a solid start to a hand. Bloodthorn Vampire and Rite of Consumption with any amount of fodder is already pretty solid, obviously Shambler's Stamina being the best one, but these are definitely some of the best cards to look for in your opening hand. And in general, except for this top god hand here, 2 lands is your ideal number of lands. That's enough that you can play 2 spells almost every single turn, and you can play any of your 2-drops that you end up drawing. You can deploy threats pretty quickly, but you're also not super flooded. 3 lands can absolutely be acceptable, but once you draw that 4th land, you're going to wish it was another spell, so it's nice to just have the 2 so that the first land doesn't hurt so much. Going beyond that, let's look at a 4-land hand that is keepable. Every extra land that you have in your opening hand means your other spells need to be that much more powerful to be able to present a win. This is not a turn 3 win as our god hand was, but it's obviously still very, very strong. We swapped the Rite of Consumption for a Swamp, but we still have a Vampire, Nested Shambler, and Stamina game plan. Without drawing a Rite of Consumption, this is not going to be an early win, but we can still just sacrifice the Shambler to the Vampire after Staminaing it, which will give us 4 1/1s and a Bloodthorn Vampire that has plenty of fodder to sacrifice. It's still a pretty cohesive, good, aggressive game plan. Definitely a keepable 4-land hand. If these spells were instead 1 Carrion Feeder, 1 Beetle, and maybe a Nested Shambler, that could be okay, but you're looking at 2 3/3s there potentially, versus here where you could have 5 1/1s, one of which is the Vampire that can grow as needed. And now let's look at 5-land hands. Just like the 4-land hands, your 2 spells that you have left need to be extremely powerful. So Nested Shambler Supernatural Stamina is probably the most important and strong combo in the deck. Bloodthorn Vampire Rite of Consumption is another one. And of course, Carrion Feeder and Beetle are also very strong. But if you look at any of these hands, they don't actually do anything by themselves. They're all missing at least one crucial card. Nested Shambler Stamina doesn't do anything without a sack outlet. Bloodthorn Vampire Rite of Consumption doesn't do anything without at least 1 piece of fodder, if not 2 or 3. And Carrion Feeder and Beetle, same thing. They need more fodder to actually function. There is no such thing as a keepable 5-land hand in this deck. There are no 2 spells that are good enough to keep a 7-card hand with 5 lands. You're just not going to be able to present an early win. Maybe if you top deck the perfect 3 cards after that, you could still win there, but there's no reason to chance it. You should always mulligan a 5-land hand if you're on 7 cards. However, once you go down on cards, obviously things change a little bit. If I had this hand, for example, on a multi 5, I would probably keep it. In fact, I would definitely keep it, because you can ship 2 swamps. 3 swamps is still a lot, but you have a Link Breaker and a Village Rites, which can maybe draw you into something else. Very reliant on what you're going to draw, but when you're already down 2 cards, you kind of have to keep anything. I would never keep this hand on 7 cards, and I would probably not keep this as a 6-card hand. Really depends on what my matchup is. If it's anything where I need to present a fast clock to race my mono red opponent or my high tide opponent, something like that, I would never be keeping this hand. And if it is something as extreme as high tide, where they have very little interaction and are probably going to win by turn 4 or 5, I might even mulligan this if I was down to 5 and go to a 4-card hand, because if you get, say, Swamp, Beetle, Feeder, and they are able to top deck a piece of fodder, that's probably going to be a better, more aggressive hand than this one. Of course, that's all chance, but you need to ask yourself, can this hand win this game? And if this is a multi 5 against High Tide, probably not, unless the 2 cards we draw from the Village Rites plus our first couple of draws are the perfect cards. I think it's actually more likely that you're going to be able to get a better 4-card hand. Now let's go to the other extreme and look at 1-landers. The deck only runs 17 lands. As an aggro deck with almost all 1-drops, you're going to have to keep some 1-landers relatively often, but that doesn't mean you should keep every single one you see. This is one that I would definitely keep, because you want to have a game plan to find your next swamp. Just staying on 1 land for the whole game is almost never going to win you the game, but as long as you have a reasonable way to try to find that second swamp, and you can find it fast enough, you can still definitely have a good game plan. This hand is pretty decent for 2 reasons. We have card diversity, lots of different types of cards. We have 3 different pieces of fodder, but Shambling Gas Connect is removal. It can also give us a treasure, which can obviously help our mana problems a little bit. We have Link Breaker and Shambler combos with stamina if we end up drawing that. Link Breaker is just another piece of fodder. Plus we have Carrion Feeder for a nice reliable clock, or a Bloodthorn Vampire for a burst of damage all at once. If these 5 creatures were all Link Breakers and Shamblers, this hand would probably be a lot worse. Or if they were all Carrion Feeders and Beetles, this hand would be a lot worse. It's nice that we have the variety. But the other main reason that we can keep it is because of Village Rites. Being able to draw 2 more cards is going to give us a very good chance to be able to draw a swamp in our next turn. If you're on the play without a Village Rites, you have 1 card to draw your swamp. On the draw, you have 2, but with the Village Rites, that goes up to 3 or 4, whether you're on the draw or the play. The chances of drawing 1 swamp in your top card are really low. The top 2 cards, it's not terrible, but it's not great. But in the top 3 or 4 cards, you have a very good chance to draw 1 land. Obviously, sometimes that won't happen. That's just bad luck. That doesn't mean that if that happens to you, you should suddenly not keep 1-landers. This is a deck where you're going to have to keep 1-landers, unfortunately. So our first course of action should be to get another swamp. So on turn 1, I would play Swamp and my Shambling Ghast here, because if I sacrifice that next turn to the Village Rites, and I don't find a land, at the very least, it will give me a treasure and I can cast something else in my hand. Then the next turn, if I draw my swamp naturally, I don't have to use the Village Rites there, in which case I might pivot and play a Feeder and another piece of fodder so I can start getting that aggressive attacker going. If I don't draw my land, though, you got to stick with that game plan. Village Rites your Shambling Ghast, draw 2, hope to hit that land drop, and if you do, you can play that land, and then you'll also have your treasure. You can develop 2 things now. Maybe go ahead with that Feeder and that Link Breaker after all. And if you whiff on your land, you're going to have just a treasure, and depending on whether you are on the play or not, you might have to discard, so you're probably going to just want to use that treasure to deploy a creature. If your opponent has some removal in their deck, you're probably going to want to just play a piece of fodder so that your Carrion Feeder doesn't get destroyed, with no way to protect it. However, if you maybe top decked 2 Carrion Feeders, then maybe it's okay to let one of them go out. I've won far more games on 1-landers that look like this then I've lost with them. Obviously, sometimes you're not going to get that land, you're going to lose, and it's going to suck. But if you then say, oh, I guess I can't keep one land hands, that's results-oriented thinking. Just because it didn't play out for you that time does not mean that that is the way you should play all the time. Now let's look at a specific one land hand that I actually had on stream the other night when I was playing Black Sack. I drew this hand on 7 cards, and without a village rights, I decided to stick to my rule of thumb and not keep this hand. I threw it back, but then I had some people asking me why I didn't keep this hand, because it looks like it has a pretty decent game plan. You can turn 1 Carrion Feeder, you can play a Beetle, you can Link Breaker, sacrifice that, and then Shambler, sacrifice that. You have 2 decent attackers. And I basically said, because I didn't have card draw, who knows if we're going to hit our second land. However, only a couple matches later, I drew this hand on 7 cards, and I actually kept it. Now, is this hand so much better than the first hand? Not really. We have more or less the same cards. We have an extra feeder instead of a beetle, which is actually probably worse because then the feeders are going to be fighting over fodder. We don't have a Bloodthorn Vampire, so we don't have that late game plan. And we do have an extra piece of fodder, which can be good with the 1 beetle and the feeder. But in general, I would say the second hand is worse. So why did I keep this second hand? Well, you're missing a bit of context that I didn't mention, which is that the first hand, I was playing against mono blue fairies. It was game 2, so I already knew what I was up against. And the second hand was against Altertron. Now, Altertron is a deck that is going to take control of the game after a certain turn. If we're lucky, that's going to be turn 5 or 6. If we're unlucky, maybe that's turn 3 if they get Tron early. But this second hand has a quick, cohesive game plan. It's a turn 5 win on just 1 land. I play a feeder on turn 1, a beetle on turn 2, and turn 3, I play a Link Breaker, sacrifice both halves of it right away. We're attacking for 6 with our feeder and our beetle. Turn 4, we play our Infestation Sage, sack both halves of that. We're attacking for 10. And then turn 5, we play our other Infestation Sage, sacrifice that. We're attacking for 14 damage. That adds up to 30 damage, plus 1 that I missed from the Carrion Feeder attacking on turn 2. 31 damage, which is going to be plenty to fight through even a Candy Trail and a mini Weather the Storm, which is exactly what they ended up playing. And this was an opponent that I knew was going to not have very much removal, and I needed a quick game plan against them. I ended up winning that game on turn 5 exactly how I laid it out. However, that first hand would play so much differently because of who I was up against. Mono Blue Fairies is a deck that 1 Spell Stutter Sprite can counter just about anything in our deck. Every single one of our 1-drops, and even a lot of our 2-drops if they have another fairy on the board. If I never draw another swamp against fairies, I'm stuck playing 1 spell every single turn that they can counter with a Spell Stutter Sprite, developing their board, then pick it back up with a ninja, repeat it, and I can really never get anything on the board. I'll never get any traction, and I will just simply lose that game. But the second hand, I don't need to draw a single card to be able to present a very quick win against an opponent that I know is unlikely to do anything about it. Your matchup matters so much, so I'm giving a lot of rules of thumb here, things to keep in mind, but depending on what matchup you're playing against, you might want to mulligan slightly or even massively differently than you would otherwise. Just as I did, I would keep a hand like this almost every single time against Tron, High Tide, Cycle Storm, maybe even like a Walls deck. But against Fairies, Grixis, Affinity, Gardens, anything with a lot of interaction, I'm snap mulliganing this every single time. Against any sort of combo deck, you're going to want one of 2 hands, either the aggressive hand that we just talked about here, or a highly disruptive hand. A disruptive hand usually targets their hand or their creatures, depending on what type of deck they are. If you're playing against High Tide or Cycle Storm, something like that, that's all spells matters in their hand. This top hand is not extremely aggressive. We have a Carrion Feeder with only 1 creature to sacrifice to it, but a Feeder on turn 1 and a Fiend on turn 2 can make it so we take any card from their hand permanently. Then we can unearth that Fiend and then Village Rights it to restock our hand while depleting theirs. This top hand is ideal against any of those sorts of decks, and after taking 2 cards from your High Tide opponent, they're going to usually have to spend several turns trying to re-find those cards. If you're against a creature-based deck like Elves or Walls, then Shambling Ghast and a Cursed Marauder with Unearth is definitely more the disruption you're looking for. Carrion Feeder, again, here doesn't present the fastest clock ever, but you have the ability to take out the first 2 or 3 creatures that they play, which can be enough to make them stumble and allow you to have more time to actually draw cards that will help your game plan. This is another hand that I had in that same stream. Rotten Reunion, so we were obviously against somebody who had some sort of reliance on the graveyard. Mortician Beetle, Link Breaker, and a Stamina to rebuy the Link Breaker. This hand's pretty decent, but it's missing one key thing, which is obviously a sack outlet. A Feeder or a Vampire is your ideal one, but even a Village Rights can make it so that we can get an extra Link Breaker down and grow our Beetle a little bit. But you have to actually look at what our game plan is if we don't draw one of those cards. Turn 1, we play a Link Breaker. Turn 2, we play a 1/1 Beetle, and we leave up our Stamina and our Rotten Reunion. This was against Rakdos Madness, so Rotten Reunion catching a snacker could be pretty good there, but also they're a pretty aggressive and fast deck, and we don't have any ability to race them here unless we draw perfectly off the top. This is the type of hand that I think a lot of people would keep because it's just kind of a lands and spells kind of a hand. But to me, this is a do-nothing hand. You get 2 1/1s on the board, and that's basically it. If you draw perfectly, maybe you win that game, but if you get kind of an average draw, you're going to lose this game almost 100% of the time. There are definitely some hands that you have to keep without a sack outlet because we only have 8 creatures in the deck that sacrifice creatures, and of course our 4 village rights, but this is just not going to be one of them. Similarly, this is a hand that I would say is a bait hand. Again, a hand that people might just think, well, it's got some good creatures and the right number of lands. And depending on the opponent I was up against, maybe I would keep this. If this was a mulligan to 6, I probably would and would just put back one of the pieces of fodder. But on a 7-card hand, you're looking for quick game plan, and without any ability to sacrifice these creatures, this is 5 1/1s and 2 swamps, and that is just not a keepable hand. Black Sack is a deck that, when looking at it, looks bad to a lot of people because it's a lot of draft chaff and just a lot of creatures that don't really do anything, but then when put together, the deck works exceptionally well. The problem is when you don't draw the right cards to put it together, you have a bunch of 1/1s, and you need to know when to get rid of that hand because this is not going to be a quick game plan against anybody at all unless you draw the right card off the top. And that's pretty much it. That is what I look for when I'm mulliganing, making sure you have a quick, cohesive game plan with not too many lands, card draw if you can, and of course some resilience, but a lot of that comes from playing your spells in the right order, all about sequencing, which we can maybe talk about in a future video. Thank you very much for watching. As mentioned, check out the deck list and the deck guide in the description, and I will see you all next time.